Welcome csc121. This is ex17 calc tip. And if you're thinking, didn't we do this at the beginning of the semester? Yes, we did. And this is the version at the beginning of the semester, which had a lot of variables, a lot of calculations, some rounding things. We had print statements. We also had an input where we entered an amount and we also entered a tip. And it worked something like this. We entered amount and we used $20 here and put a tip amount, 25, and then it gave us some print statements. So that was just some early coding that we were doing in the semester. And you can see it's kind of a mess of code here. And what I just wanted to go over, especially as we started talking about functions, was in ex17, we just took that same idea since it's something we've already done. And here we're creating a function called calctip to kind of organize it a little bit better. So we don't have to have all these lines of code. So it has something that's defined. Calctip is of exactly what's going to happen. And in this one, we're not going to do inputs. We're actually going to just send arguments. And so we set up parameters because two things that we did with the input is, and you could always add an input with this above it, but what we're going to use here is two parameters, meal and tip percent. And that's actually what we did on the first one. On the first one, we had all that stuff in here with inputs, but we're just kind of skipping over that. The idea of this again is just to go over the return. That's all we're really doing here, that we're setting up a function with a return value. And again, I'm not even going to retype all this. I'll just go through it. And the function definition is calctip. It has two, these are called the parameters. So it's looking for values, two separate values separated by a comma. So it's looking for two values. They're going to be numbers. It doesn't indicate that yet, but that's what they're going to be. So these should make sense. Looking for a meal and a tip percent. What it's going to do, here's the calculation. It's going to take the meal, multiply it by the tip percent, and times 0.01 or divide it by 100, whatever you prefer, so that you don't have to do that in a separate line. So that's the return. Now you could actually put you could return a variable, like you could do something like this. You could do something like that, and then that's the return, but it's the same thing. Saying return tip or saying return the calculation does the same thing. It's going to return a value. So whatever the value is, whether it's 5, if you do 20 and 25, if it's 5, so it's just going to return 5 either way. So we're just returning a value from that, and that's all we want to use for other things. So as we go down here, here's our function call. Now we don't always have to have a variable represent a function call, but because we're going to use that value in a print statement, it's helpful sometimes to not be trying to put a function call within a print statement. That can be kind of confusing because there's parentheses and all that, inside of parentheses, inside of curly braces, inside of quotes and all that. So that could get confusing. So by using a variable right here, tip amount, that represents the result, and it's actually going to be whatever's returned. Tip amount is going to be equal to whatever's returned from the function call. And here we're using m and t. Just to be different from this is the actual parameters or the arguments, and a lot of times they'll be different. And whether you use m and t up here or wherever it is, we usually make them different. They're not always the same because it can be a little confusing if they're all the same, because you might think they're variables and they sort of act like variables, but they kind of they're temporary and they get sent just for the function call. So what we did here is we said m is 20, t is 25. And that just means our meal is going to be 20, our tip is going to be 25, our tip percent is going to be 25. But anyway, these are our numbers that are going to just get stuck in there. So we're going to get 20 and 25. They're going to just get put in here. We could have just as easily had 20 and 25. We could have done that and eliminated this and deleted this and not had that. That would be fine too. But the purpose of this, again, by using variables that represent the argument, the purpose of this is that way you could use these things down here. Because look, we're using m down here, and we're going to put 20. A $20 meal with a 25% tip is a tip amount. So by using these variables, m, t, and tip amount, it just helps our print statement in the end. Notice I'm actually making the statement a variable, so I don't have to put all these things in more parentheses. So I'm using the f strings here as just a string, and then that's going to get plugged in there. So you kind of have it's another step to just kind of help readability of the print statement. So that's all that's happening with a return here. So the idea is just to kind of show you that we have parameters, that it takes two parameters, it takes two values, and it's going to look for the values down here. And the values can sometimes come in the form of variables. So even though these are kind of like variables, you can also set up variables ahead of time that are going to get plugged into there, because that may be just easier to understand, and they have a dual purpose too, because these variables are then going to be used in this print statement. So that's all we did with ex17. It's not very complicated, but hopefully it's starting to make our code a little bit more organized and a little bit more efficient than what we had this time around, which you got to look through all this stuff to try and really figure out what's happening. It's actually serving a purpose here. It's not just running through procedures, it's serving a purpose, and then we're using that in a print statement. So that's all we did with ex17, just to kind of review the idea of a return statement and to review parameters, arguments, and then even using global variables here as well. These are global because they're outside a function. And these, we don't need local variables. Tip is actually a local variable in here, but you don't even need this. So that's just a return value from a function, ex17.